Hello, this is another one of my videos on Alistair Parker's short history of the Second World War. This comes from the final chapter on the impact of war and deals with separation, family life and the role of women. Some 50 to 60 million people lost their lives in World War II, and around the same number were uprooted from their homes, either temporarily or permanently. Most of the soldiers, sailors and airmen of all the involved nations had been pulled out from civilian life to endure, or sometimes enjoy, a temporary absence from home. Of these, the American and British Empire forces travelled the most widely, and along with the Japanese, stayed from home the longest. For their part, German troops remained in Europe and for a short time North Africa, and could be moved from one theatre of war to another with comparative ease and frequency, whether from the Volga to the Loire or from Narvik to Tripoli. Home leave for them was easily available. Some of them, such as administrative troops in France, might even have an easy war. By contrast, the British in North Africa might spend years away from home in uncomfortable conditions, after which their later popular welcome in Italy and France could be a compensation. Most servicemen were not directly involved in fighting as combat infantry or bomber crews, and for them the war provided adventure without undue danger. They might have unexpected and exotic experiences, although the Americans commonly transplanted reassuring reminders from home, and some expressed boredom at the unfamiliar. American troops in Britain were well fed and well paid compared to their hosts, but speaking the same language, they were generally welcomed and fraternized easily with the locals. Over 60,000 of them married British women by war's end. Black Americans experienced an unsegregated and, in the 1940s, non-racist society. Wartime separation often encouraged hasty marriages, which made families less stable. By 1945, the American divorce rate had doubled, and in Britain, quintupled. There was a marked increase in the number of illegitimate births, by 50% in the United States, and tripled in Britain. Bombing and the threat of bombing disrupted family life, especially in Britain and Germany, with children being evacuated from threatened towns and a resultant interruption in schooling and a loss of parental care. In 1946, after the war was over, the British Army found its intake of 19-year-olds seriously deficient in their educational accomplishments compared to those who had left school prior to the war. Massively worse were the handicaps experienced by those living in the German-occupied territories in the east, or those forced into German compulsory labour in both west and east. One measure of movement comes from Britain, where the post office recorded 60 million changes of address between 1939 and 1945, among a population of only about 40 million people. The mobilization of labour, both for food and weapons production, caused men and women to move and relationships to change, as also, of course, did entry into the armed services. Some historians have argued that the war brought a fundamental and permanent emancipation of women. Women became responsible for their own lives because men were away. They directed their families and households. More received incomes as their own, both allowances for wives and young children of men serving in the military, wages for industrial work, and pay from the women's services. The women entered occupations hitherto reserved for men. Some women found opportunities for self-reliant independence and far more rewarding lives than before the war. However, such gains were limited and transitory. Women's jobs were wartime expedients, not long-time vocations. Careers were not opened. Managerial or supervisory jobs were only reluctantly conceded to women, as were skilled jobs in industry. The situation in post-war Britain and the United States needs particular scrutiny in this regard. In Germany, and the Soviet Union, by contrast, the large number of men killed during the war ensured that there was a continuing demand for working women even after their economies had recovered. In countries occupied by Germany, there was no experience of liberation, while in Japan, rigid patterns of male dominance easily survived the war unshaken. The most important fact about the wartime liberation of women in Britain and the United States, insofar as it actually occurred, is that it was unwelcome to almost everyone involved and thought to be only a temporary anomaly. The men who went to war expected to return to enjoy their pre-war priority over women in employment, except in specifically women's work. Pressure from the British Minister for Labour, Ernest Bevin, won promises for day care for small children, but it was provided only on a limited scale and disappeared after the war. The number of nursery schools was greatly increased, but as these observed school hours or less and school holidays, they weren't convenient for full-time working mothers. In the United States, the government vigorously promoted daycare nurseries, but only as a wartime expedient. In both Britain and the United States, the authorities regarded the demand for labor from working mothers as a wartime necessity, but not as something desirable in itself, and most women seem to have agreed. The dangers and worries of war enhanced what Parker refers to as the retrospectively romanticized attractions of pre-war domesticity. The war also enhanced the prestige of masculinity. The most admired roles being those of dashing, decisive commanders, Air Force pilots, submarine crews, parachute troops, commandos, and tank captains. A few women also distinguished themselves in secret work, especially in the resistance. This involvement being one reason why de Gaulle decreed women's suffrage in France in 1944, at a time when he needed to confirm resistance support for himself. With some men risking their lives and millions of men in uniform ready to do so in theory, few women were greatly inclined to begrudge their right to cosseting and privileges after the longed-for moment of their return. It was not a time when women thought of challenging men's dominance or were encouraged to do so. One scholar noted that wartime publicity included images that reified gender arrangements as rigidly as they had been demarcated in the Victorian period. Immediately after the war, women married earlier were more likely to marry and had more children than had women pre-war. In 1931, British women constituted 29.8% of the workforce, and 20 years later, in 1951, this had increased to only 30.8%. In the United States, the figures were 25.9% pre-war and only 27.9% in 1947. The 1945 figure of 36% here was the anomaly. The war interrupted a slowly developing trend in the 20th century towards greater freedom for women. But what eventually caused its resumption was post-war prosperity, rather than the transitory increases in opportunity during the war. So thank you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement. Without them, I wouldn't be able to make these videos. You're very welcome to support my channel. If you so wish, please do like, comment, and share on the videos. It really does help. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give a Patreon link below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll turn to the subject of forced migration. Have a good day.